GCSE, it's me Charlotte and today I'm joined by Mrs Cory. So do get your questions in for Mrs Cory. If you've had exams today, how did they go? Let us know. I'll just refresh to get the comments. Yeah, everyone get your questions in. Oh, someone says key quotes for the Lord of the Flies.
Ooh. That depends. It depends. Yeah. You definitely need to be looking at the You've put me on the spot there. It depends on which character, doesn't it? You need to. That is massive. There probably could be an A4 sheet of paper for every single character on there.
Yeah.
Be a bit more specific. Come back to us.
Yeah, definitely.
What are you thinking about?
Matteo says, what is the best poems to revise being broad in conflict and power?
Okay, well, I don't teach AQA, but I've brought with me, allegedly I brought with me in this ream of paper, some of the poems. So this would be, give me 1 minute to find it. This is the poems for, where is the list? Power and conflict. So this is the war photographer. Those.
Oh, yes.
Somewhere I have a list of them. Oh, really sorry. What was the question again? What is the best poems to write? All of them. You have most obvious answer actually. You have an anthology of poetry. You have a list of poems. Mm-hmm. There's not that many. You really do need to have a look at them. Your teacher would have explained to you which poems came up in the last 2 years. And you need to, they may not come up again, but then again they might, because if they give you a poem and they ask you to apply it to a theme, then you need to go with the poems that you're most comfortable with. Yeah,
definitely. I definitely agree with that. Characters for Christmas Carol summaries.
Summaries. Your key characters are going to be your ghosts. It will be Bob and Tiny Tim, and of course Ebenezer Scrooge. But in the past, other characters have come up. I'm sure his the nephew's come up, and also Fezziwig has come up as well. So again, it's really broad. Picking the best character depends on what has come up previously on your exam papers, and your tutor would have gone through that with you. It's more a case of looking at how the characters link with each other, and maybe sitting down tonight and looking at all your characters, trying to link them together and see where you can look at where they fit into key points, because they will come up with a key theme, and generally the character question will tie in with the theme question as well. So that's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I would have quite liked to have done a Christmas Carol. It seems quite interesting.
It is. I taught it a few years ago for GCSE. It is really good.
Yeah.
It was good fun.
Someone says predictions for love and relationship poems for tomorrow's exam.
I'm really sorry again. Predictions is nothing.
We're not very good at predictions.
We're not. Just because it depends. They don't typically come up with the same poem again, but they do. Sometimes again, they will. So if they come up with a theme, you need to apply that theme to any of those poems that you have learnt for love and relationships for AQA.
Yes. Chloe says, how do you structure an answer for an unseen poem?
Okay. I would look for, wherever the question is, the keyword. Say they say, how is nature presented in this poem? I would go through and I would structure it by points. And I would clearly go for some clear points of your essay. I've shared, let me just lean forward, I've shared this link on in the comments below, and this will help you structure your poem, how you write about the poem, but you really must look for clear points through it. Also, maybe to track through is a good way to do it as well, is to start at the top, look at the title, how does the title tie in with the theme, and then go through the poem and look for key points. But remember, you need to talk about the language the form and the structure. So you need to make sure that you adorn all of those things as you go through. Another thing is you need to maybe always talk about why the poet's done it. So not only are you saying what this quote, how they've done it, it's a metaphor, you need to be saying because to yourself, because they've put this in because, and that's your word. Don't necessarily write it, but you need to keep saying because to yourself. You need to explain as much as possible as you go through to analyse that poem.
Yeah, I think referring back to the question is quite important, because that's one thing that I didn't do. Like throughout my exam, you always just make sure you're mentioning the title again. People are saying, do you think Edna will come up for an Inspector Calls?
The maid, probably not. But please don't quote me on that. I will not place bets on it. But I've never known Edna come up because she's the tiniest. I think she's got what, 3 lines.
Yeah.
But any of the other characters could come up that are in the family, and the inspector of course, and Eva. So generally I've never known Edna come up, but don't worry with their 2 quotes.
Someone said Edna did come up for the EdXL exam.
Really? Okay.
Wow.
When was that, Layla?
Yeah,
that's unusual. Maybe because Edna is the one that opens the door and says an inspector is here, an inspector is called, maybe. But that's an unusual one.
Yeah. Sarah says, how many quotes should you learn per poem?
Your poems are not. I thought your poems were open book. I thought your poems came up for you. If the poems are not, if you're not open book, which I thought they were, then you need to make sure that you. You need to make sure that you've got at least 2 or 3 good quotes for each of your poems linking to the themes. So if your poem links to maybe 2 themes, I would try and have about a good 2 or 3 quotes that you can remember. But generally, the poetry is anthology open book, so you should have a copy of it in front of you.
Yeah. Best way to structure comparing the poems?
I've advised my students to make a clear topic point for that you're going to look at, and then say this, and then look at both poems. So you're doing it constantly all the way through as analysis and comparison or contrast. The part of the mark scheme for both of the exam boards is that you are showing a thorough compare and contrast. If you write about one poem and then move on to the second, you might run out of time, or you might not compare similar aspects of the poem, and that's what you need to be doing, is comparing similar aspects. So I would write a point. Nature is presented through the figurative language that's used, and then look, in one poem it's looked at this way, however in another poem it's looked at this way, and I would go through that way with your points, always referring each of those paragraphs, then always referring back to the question and the keywords, as Charlotte said.
Milton says, how should you manage your time in an exam? Well, I think normally there's a amount of time that you should spend this much time on this question, so I think definitely try and stick to that. That's what I did. Always make sure you're looking at how much time you're spending on each question. Yeah,
definitely. For example, the EdXL, I think this is the EdXL poem paper. You've got 2 hours 15 minutes. 2 hours 15 minutes. So question 1, section A, is you've only got 55 minutes, and I would clearly look at the clock. What time did you start? And be making sure that you've within 50 minutes you were going, you were stopping what you're doing, and you are wrapping up, and you're going back and maybe doing a proofread through, and then moving on. So make sure you know which of the exam board you're working with. And the exam paper will always recommend how much time you should spend on each question, because they've worked it out, because there's percentages of the questions. You get 10% of the marks from this question or 20 from another question. So you need to make sure you're using the appropriate amount of time.
Yeah, and I definitely say at the end of your English exam, there's a lot of people that say, oh, it's an essay, there's no point me checking over it. But I definitely would, because you lose marks for spelling and grammar, so you could just read through your essay, making sure you've got all that right. And then you never know, you might think of something else that you think is useful to add in, so I'd definitely say check your essays. Someone before said, what's the main context for an inspector calls?
Probably the social reform. Priestley was a social reformist. You know, he was part of the people that the Fabian Society set up London School of Economics. So if you know your history for that, that was what he was saying. He wanted, and at the time when the play was written, which was post-war, he was, you know, his target audience were the upper classes. So he was speaking to them directly through his play, and he was expecting them to change the way they looked on people, regardless of whether they were a factory worker or a prostitute or, you know, an unmarried mother or any of those things. He was a social reformist, and that's one of your key themes through that novel. Can you think of anything else you did?
Yeah, I'd definitely say a lot of I think theme-wise, it's a lot of like deception, and I wrote a lot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, there is, and there's and the fact that who the inspector is, that he's the voice, he's like an omniscient person that's in there.
Definitely.
And he knows everything, and he knows everything about everyone, and the way he delivers it as well is the suspense is one of the key themes through it as well.
I think it's also like the society that the Priestleys were in at the time. That definitely they're quite high up in the social ranking, and that shows that just because you're high up in the social ranking doesn't mean that you're necessarily the best people and that you're not flawed. Yeah. Someone says, what is the main context for Jekyll and Hyde?
Really sorry.
Yeah.
Never taught Jekyll and Hyde. Never. I'm really sorry.
I've never done Jekyll and Hyde either.
Again, it's Victorian. It's a Victorian novel, so you should know. You should have been in your lessons, and you should know. You need to go back over your notes, and you need to see what you were taught in your lessons for the context, for the time in which a novel was written. But also remember, you need to look at alternative viewpoints to get the higher grade. So you need to be looking at the time in which it's read as well. So it's not just the context; it's the context of the novel. So you need to, how is it presented today? What is it representing to a modern day audience as opposed to an audience at the time in which the novel was published?
Yeah. Someone said, how would I approach an unseen poem that I don't understand?
An unseen poem that you don't understand, you will be able to grasp something from it. All of the exam boards' advice, the advice they give their examiners is that to credit credible answers. So as long as you go through it and you stick to your point, you can be developed and sustained all the way through your essay. So if you go through there and you decide, I don't know, come up with a poem and you're thinking, I really don't know, you need to come up with something. The title will give you clues. There'll be, there'll be something in there. They're not out to trick you. Yeah. They're out there for you to be able to infer from the poem. So your personal engagement with it and your personal inference is not wrong. You might not be what it says on the exam board, on the exam mark criteria, but as long as you go through and you stick to it and you've got evidence to back that up and it's credible, and it's not fantastical, then you should be okay. So you really shouldn't worry about that.
I mean, like Mrs Cory said, make sure you write something. There'll be clues in the poem. I recommend reading it quite a few times I think they normally recommend like 2 or 3 times read it through. So you might get something, once you've read it through. I'd also say definitely paragraphs. If you've got a point, make sure you're structuring your paragraphs correctly. Yeah. That's a good comment up here. What's the best way to revise quotes?
For me and for my students, we use these little note cards.
I did that.
Yeah, and so they'll have their character on them, or they'll have their theme on there, and they'll pick out the key quotes for each of the poems, or for a poem, and they just tonight is probably a harder time for you to do this, but over the last few weeks my students have been discussing characters and using quotes, and they use quotes as banter, and so they've been insulting each other by quotes and using it as in general conversation as we go along, and try and get in as many as possible and make it fun, because that way they stick in your head rather than you trying to trying to remember as many possible tonight will be really, really difficult. My advice would be to go through, look for key quotes for your characters, and then potentially highlighting the ones that you think and that you can work with, and manipulate them into your essay. You might be able to use them and say, for example, Scrooge said this, and to back up something about his character, you might be able to bring in a quote to add some evidence, which not necessarily answers your question, but if you're stuck, you really can put in quotes to show that you need to prove that you have a secure or thorough understanding of your text, and you do that through the way you talk about your characters or themes.
Definitely. I got people to test me with my flashcards, and I also found it was really helpful. I recorded quotes on like a voice memo, and like on my way to school I just listened to them, so I think that would be really beneficial for you guys.
Grade 9 was that? Tips?
Yeah. Do we need to talk about structure to get a high level? Any tips on a level 9?
Okay, for structure, some of the key things that you do for structure, so you would be looking at talking about maybe the rhythm, the rhyme, maybe you for a 9, your 9 doesn't come out so much. For your higher levels, you will be looking at everything all together. You won't be talking just about structure, just about form, just about language. It will flow and it will come through as you're writing through about your poem. But for structure, form is how it looks on the page, and how many stanzas it's in. Your structure then is the enjambment or the caesura, or where the lines run on the enjambment, and it takes away from the strict rhyme scheme that's at the side, and which is the form, and it will just develop as you go through. But if it's the rhythm and the rhyme, if it's an unseen, you need to be looking at reading it out loud in your head, if that makes sense. Yeah. Rather than just trying to read it on the page, try and sound it out to yourself, so you can pick up on those little nuances that are in there of rhythm and rhyme, and the flow as it goes through, and the pace. You'll pick up on the meter that's in there as well. So if something's quick and pacey, that will probably be because it's linking with whatever's going on in the poem at that time. And you need to kind of pick up on all of those things to get those higher grades.
Yeah, definitely. I like this question from Ben, because this is something I struggled with as well. When in a question, how long do you use the novel as a whole without retelling the whole novel?
When in a question, how do you use the novel as a whole? If you start putting then in, THEN, then this happened, that's when it becomes narrative. So you don't want to do that. You would maybe want to talk about different parts of the novel around a point. So this is where your planning comes in, and you need to make sure you're answering the question, how is social injustice presented through Lord of the Flies or something like that. So you need to clearly go through, and you will pick out key points, but you're not explaining the point. You're not explaining the story and how it happens. You might talk about this character presents this and this character presents that, and you look at it that way rather than avoid the word then.
Yeah,
okay?
Definitely.
Always avoid the word when, and always use the word because. Not in your essay necessarily, but you need to be thinking, right, and that happened because, and that happened because, and if you can, and that further explanation will help you analyse the poem or the novel further.
Yeah, I'm just going to scroll up because we're getting a lot of really good questions.
How do you embed context in an Inspector Calls essay?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so it depends on what the examination question is, but your context is not something that you bolt on, and that can always be a mistake. Do not have an introduction about context and don't bolt it on in chunks. You need to talk about this something that happens and how maybe in society at the time this was frowned upon, or the religion in the country at the time, or the change, the post-war change. And remember, it was set before the First World War, but not written until 1945. So not written until after the Second World War. And at the time, Priestley was part of the people who were looking to change. They were looking to bring in the National Health Service. They were looking to bring in social reform across the United Kingdom. And by doing that, he would, that you could say by him showing a young woman who's selling herself, at a club at night, this was the only way she could survive post-war or before the war. And the limited opportunities for her, she'd been blacklisted as a worker, and the consequences for that. The fact that you can't just pick yourself up and move to another town, being that itinerant person was very difficult at that time, because people didn't live that way then. Even though we were post-industrial revolution, people tended to still live within the community they knew, where they had a social network.
Yeah, I definitely say in your essay, if it's a question where you don't need much context, don't just put context in for the sake of it, because they've got a very specific thing which they mark you off, like criteria. So if it's not on their criteria, you're just wasting your time. Tia says, how do you analyse form in depth in terms of oral poetry, ballads, epic form, etc.?
Again, the form. If you're talking about those that genre of poetry, with you need to be explaining about how, maybe a little bit of how that was delivered, and the reason for it with the ballads, that people didn't necessarily read and write is the history of the ballad. So it was delivered that way, and as little stories that people could remember. But form in general, it depends on what your poem is and how it comes across. How do you analyse form in depth? You actually don't need to analyse form in depth. The marking criteria, if I just read it here, says a perceptive grasp of form and structure and their effect. So it would be a case of looking at this form of a poem, the way it is laid out on this page, or the fact that it is a ballad, which or always have a tragic ending. They're always kind of unrequited love, or love that's gone wrong, that kind of thing, or a sonnet that is always a love poem, or you would have studied that in your lessons, what the form of those poems are and why they are, why it has been used. So you need to explain, but sprinkle it in. It's kind of like glitter in a way, that you would add that, like the context. It all needs to knit together, and it needs to be that interrelationship between the form and structure at the same time as the language. I wouldn't necessarily segregate them and discuss them separately, because they should flow together.
Yeah.
The mark scheme is talking about it being a convincing understanding of the relationship between the poetries and context, integrated response, cohesive evaluation of the poet's language and effect. They're the things you need to be looking for. Why they've done it, what is the effect they've intended for that. And your structure and your form will come into that as long as you're carefully and closely analysing your language as well.
Yeah. Isabel says, do we need introductions and conclusions for our essays?
Yes, but very brief. I would, if you've planned it, if you've spent a few minutes and you've planned it, it might be, I'm going to look at how, I don't know, the American, this isn't one of yours, but the American Dream is in Mice and Men, which was the edXL paper one. You would say this essay is going to look at, Lenny and George, then it's going to look at Curly's wife, and then it's going to look at Candy, and each of these and how the American Dream or the aspirations fitted in with these characters. And it would be a very, very brief introduction. But you need to make sure as well that because you need to have it to be a cohesive and you need clarity, you do need to conclude as well. But again, that could be, finally, in conclusion, and very simply, going back to the question, going back and showing that you've gone back to the question. American Dream is prevalent throughout the novel, and as it is shown through these characters. Just a very brief summary.
Yes, definitely. We keep having really good questions. So, people saying, I do like 6 for poetry, 1 for each paragraph, but add another into paragraph. 6 quotes per poem, I think. Can you please explain what poems would be good to compare?
Well, number 1, which exam board are you?
Yes.
And which anthology are you using? That would be a good start.
Yeah, definitely.
There's loads of really good feedback to each other on here. I know there's a little bit of banter going on.
Oh, definitely.
But also, some of you are asking your questions and you were clearly supporting each other, which is really, really lovely to see.
Yeah. Ella Rose says, what structure should we use for poetry exam? Is it like peel? Yeah, we did P paragraphs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've taught my students Peter, which is point, explain, terminology, point, evidence, terminology, explanation, and then relate it back to the question.
Yeah.
So Peter is what we use, but it might have been peel, it might have been P.
Peel or P.
It's what you've been taught. To try not to move too far away from what you've been doing, because your English teachers within their department would have a strategy of how they work within the department, and you may find that you've been given a foundation of skills in year 7 that are working all the way up to this point, because that's how we've worked in the schools I've worked at. But like I say, if you're stuck, you have nothing. Point, evidence, terminology, if you can put that in, or the technique in which how it's been done, so it's what and how. Then PETE, explanation, in which you're going to say why, the effect comes into that one, and then relate it back to the question.
Yeah, definitely. How do you answer an 8 marker?
All right, so again, depending on if you're looking at your poetry or your prose, you need to make sure it has to be well informed. You need to know your text really well. You need to be making comparisons, and they need to be and contrasts, and they need to be perceptive. Okay, they can't be just bog standard straightforward. You need to be looking for really subtle links between these, tying in form and structure again, and the effect and the language. I always tell my students as well, they need to look for varying viewpoints. So you might say, for example, one reader might see it this way, however, significantly for me, a stronger reading could be, and show that you've evaluated, because that is definitely in a level 5, you need to be doing the evaluation process. So physically show on the paper, literally show the examiner that you were evaluating. It could be this, however, a stronger reading could be this, and weigh that up. And you can do that because you could then compare it and contrast while you're doing that. That shows that you are you're being more perceptive and you're looking for wider read of the text.
Yeah, definitely. We had one before. Who is to blame for Eva Smith's death, and how would you write an essay on that?
Oh my goodness gracious me! How
It's not a definitive answer.
No, who do you think is at fault? Is it Mrs. Berlin because she doesn't help her out? Is it Mr. Berlin because he sacks her? It depends, doesn't it? It really does. Is it her own fault? Maybe she should have kept her mouth, mouth shut and should have stayed quiet and not asked for more money. Who knows? That's up to you, and you need to get your view on that and where you come from for that, because that's the only way you're going to be able to answer that question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Who do we need to refer to the poets' names in a poetry exam?
Yeah, you do, but please use their surname. You're not their best friend. They don't live next door. You don't have a cup of tea with them, so you're not going to be saying William wrote this, or Carol Ann wrote that. You're going to be calling them by their surname. That's the respectful way of how we write about authors and poets, playwrights. So make sure you're always it's Priestley. It's Dickens, and you need to address them that way when you go through. Even if they've got a massive surname, tough, you need to still use their surname. Likewise, if you've got a big title on a poem, you don't keep needing to refer to that if you can shorten it to just put in the name of the poet all the way through.
We had one before. So the girl that said about comparing poems came back and said, can you please explain what poems would be good to compare for love and relationship? Well, it depends on your exam board. And
it depends on your question, because they're not gonna randomly, let me have a look. Love and relationships. So page 34. So I think this is Lasher's paper. I might be wrong. So it says, compare how poets present romantic love in sing-song and in one other poem. You need to know what to compare. You need to sit down tonight, if you haven't already done it, and you need to look at your anthology and your poems, and you need to find links. So I'd make a mind map. And that would probably be the best revision you could do tonight, is to sit down and just make some mind maps of what links you could have, which poems go with each other and why.
Yeah, so we're going to wrap up soon, so everyone get your final questions in for Mrs. Cory. Chrissy says, am I right to say if you make a point, as long as you prove it, it's always right?
As long as it's realistic, and it's as long as it's it's not fantastical. But it is true. It's not maths. There's no right or wrong answer. You're perceptive, and you go through, and you can argue it, and argue it well with your because and your because. You should be okay putting in your evidence, as long as you make a point, you evidence it, and you explain it. You shouldn't go far wrong, because exam boards, every single one of the exam boards are told. The examiners are told to credit credible answers.
Yeah. Tia says, how long should we spend on each question, and what section do you recommend we do first?
I would go through and all of your questions to start with. The questions are weighted differently depending on which exam board you're with. For example, have a look. I go back to it again. This is the Edexcel paper. So the Edexcel paper section A, you choose part A, one question, part A or part B. It's 55 minutes. Then your anthology poem, 35 minutes, and then you've got 45 minutes for your unseen. So you just need to go through it all, check you've gone through the whole exam paper and know what you're doing. And if it's confidence for you, and if it's I would go with the question then that you like the most.
Definitely.
And the question that you think, right, I'm confident in this, I'm going to answer this one first, because that's going to make you feel better about approaching a second question. It's imperative that you stick to the times. The exam board, all of the exam boards will give you a time frame in which they feel that you should be able to answer that question. They will help you with that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you everyone. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Mrs. Cory, for coming in. Thank you guys. Bye.